Tell us a little bit about yourself beyond Mo's professional brief.
Sure. So yes, I've actually been in the journal 20 years. That bio was a little stale, which is a long time. And I've covered a lot of Wall Street related topics, the credit markets, hedge funds, private equity. I've written the Heard on the Street column. And now they let me wander, which is a great job. But it's mostly financial. And I'll segue maybe into our topic, the frackers a little bit. I'll just kind of explain why I got excited about this topic.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point because really you've written about hedge funds and big trades and what moves the market on a weekly basis. And I am really curious as to how you sort of wandered from that into little Nowheresville-like towns in Texas to find this revolution.
So a few years ago, I looked for revolutions, as you kind of suggest, and I wrote a book called The Greatest Trade Ever, which is about the people who anticipated the financial crisis. And I'm really a fan of, I'm a sports guy, so I love home runs and strikeouts, and that's people and firms that do really well, discover something, make a lot of money, change the course of history, as it were, from the business side, and those who kind of blow it. Strikeouts, something embarrassing. There's a lot of drama in those kind of narratives, and you can learn lessons also as an investor, as a business person. So I'd written this book, The Greatest Trade Ever, and it just struck me that the most important business topic today was back then, but you can argue maybe today as well, is this revolution that was happening in our nation's or the United States' heartland. And I didn't know much about it. And we hadn't really written about who the people are that were the pioneers. So I love writing about the people, and I really believe as a writer you can get at some important themes through the people. It's sort of a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down is kind of my approach to writing. So that's kind of what I set out to do, get out there and get away from my desk a little bit in New York and travel little towns in Texas and Pennsylvania, North Dakota, Louisiana, all kinds of places, Oklahoma for sure, and meet the people that were changing the country, but also all the world. And that's kind of how I threw myself into this project.
So revolution's a big word. Put some meat on the bones of why this qualifies as a revolution.
Sure. So what I find interesting about it is that it has an impact on all kinds of areas. Obviously the economy, and over the last really kind of took off in 2007. Since then, it's been a big part. When I say it, I mean the energy revolution, the fracking, shale revolution that's sent production from, we got down to about 5.5 million barrels a day in 2006 to, we hit 9.3 before obviously oil prices collapsed. And now we're down to about, we're gonna plateau about 8.5 or so, which is still an amazing, remarkable increase, and the likes of which the world's never seen. So it's impacted the economy of the United States. It was a big percentage of growth over the last number of years until the collapse. Obviously the environment, we've had all kinds of, we can discuss it, and afterwards people want to come up, we can discuss it, or if you want to chat about it, there are, I would argue, positives and negatives in terms of an impact. Positive in that we've shifted away from coal more than ever. As a result, carbon dioxide emissions have plummeted in the United States. Those are great things. You've also had mistakes made by a lot of the frackers, especially early on in places in Pennsylvania that I visited, Dimmock and all kinds of other areas. So, and there are concerns about the future that my biggest concern, I'm not really that worried environmentally, my biggest concern is that we get addicted to cheap fossil fuels and we shift away from focus on things like wind and solar. So there's an impact on the environment, there's impact on geopolitics. I mean, think back a few years ago, President Obama said, there's a red line, and if Assad crosses it in Syria, we're getting involved. And he did cross it, and the Saudis begged the United States to get involved. And I think part of the reason why the United States didn't get involved is because of the frackers, and because we the United States don't care as much what the Saudis think. And we're sort of trying to pivot a little bit away from the Middle East to the extent that the United States can. That's going to continue. The reason the United States was able to boycott Iran and is partly because of all the oil coming up from the fields in North Dakota and Texas. So I can go on and on. There's remarkable economic, environmental, geopolitical impacts. It's going to affect things going forward as well. Other countries have even started their own shale revolutions, but nations around the world are sitting on deep pockets of shale. Argentina, Mexico, Poland, the UK, China. I mean, if you care about global warming, you got to pray that the Chinese start fracking, because we need them to shift away from reliance on coal, and that's one possible way. So I can go on and on, but that's why I thought it was a big revolution.
So you probably started with some preconceptions about what the fracking industry was, where it was going, how it was headed there. Greg, what would you say are the things that most surprised you as you got further into the research?
And that's a good question. So I'm born in the East Coast of the United States and live in New Jersey. I work in New York, and like some people in this room probably, when I went out to talk to these people, I thought they'd be sort of, wealthy barons giggling their way to the bank as they spilled and polluted and all this kind of stuff. And they do spill and pollute, don't get me wrong, but they're much more conscious of the environment than you would think. They're out in the fields. I sit at my desk all day long, Sometimes I get a break and go get lunch or something, but they're all out in the fields. They've got ranches and they hunt and fish, and they're not oblivious to the environment, and they like to think that they're actually, some of them are quite conscious of what they do, and they try to do well. So they're not polluters. They're not trying to be polluters. They can be polluters, but they're not consciously polluting. But also, I guess the biggest thing that jumped out at me, and it's a huge paradox, and it gets to the theme that of this whole session, is who the people are behind this revolution. It's not who you would expect. So who should have, and I'm sorry I speak so quickly, but who should have led this revolution? It should have been the majors, right? It should have been ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil's headquarters in Irving, Texas are literally, not even figuratively, literally on top of the Barnett Shale. That's where their headquarters are. They're in their own backyard, literal backyard. And were they drilling in the United States and Texas? And the Barnett Shale is sort of ground zero for where this whole revolution started, where they, as you know that area very well. No, they'd given up on America. They were drilling offshore and Africa and Asia. They weren't drilling in their own literal backyard, and that just astounded me. And I go on and on. As you know in the book, there are other examples too. Chevron was really early. They had a group to do what they called non-conventional drilling. And they should have been the one to change the world. And they had a young, an executive, a senior executive named Ray Galvin, who was leading the charge, and he hired some really good people. I think you read the book, so those who have read the book. But Ray Galvin hired some good people, geologists, engineers, and they really should have been the ones to change the world, and yet they weren't, because his own colleagues didn't believe in this drilling. In other words, I assume half the people in this room are really knowledgeable about this, and maybe half aren't, but basically the whole revolution is fracking, hydraulic fracturing of shale rock. We always were fracking, but we never really were doing it in shale. And it always seemed too expensive and too difficult. And we can explain how it happened, but basically in the United States, some kind of wildcatters and frackers, I call them, they proved the ability to do that. And the other revolution is turning the drill bit horizontally, horizontal drilling. And anyway, Chevron didn't believe. Their own people believed in the conventional wisdom, was that the United States was running out of oil and gas. So the big guys got it wrong, all the private equity guys. So TXU was the biggest LBO in history, and that was a buyout of a big Texas utility. And that was a bet on rising natural gas prices. And who did TXU buy out? KKR, Goldman Sachs, Warren Buffett bought up the debt. So everyone got it wrong. All the experts got it wrong, which is a little bit like the financial crisis, sort of my first book. So that was a paradox that jumped out at me.
Right. So it would be really instructive to get into what fracking is all about. It sort of appeals to my techie side of things, but we probably don't have time for that. Perhaps if you have a burning desire to know, you should talk to Greg afterwards.
Or you.
Yeah. Greg, you alluded to it earlier on, but one of the things that's interesting in your account of the frackers is just how much personalities figure into this whole thing. It seems like the force of personalities moved the needle on what ultimately happened. Can you talk a little bit about some of the key people that you think were relevant to the developments? Sure,
and it's a good point, because it did take a certain personality to ignore conventional wisdom, that shale wasn't going to work out. The United States was clearly running out of oil and gas, and to ignore these guys takes a real guts, and I'm not sure I would have been able to do it. It's easy for me. I'm writing about it after it happened, right? So, but these kind of people, to have that confidence in yourself and stubbornness as well. So the first person I guess I would mention is George Mitchell, not the former senator, is a oil guy, natural gas really, in Texas, and I went out to visit him a few years ago before he passed away. When I visited him, he was in his 80s, sharp as a tack, and he told me his story. It's a fascinating story. Basically, he was running a mid-sized natural gas company in Texas, and this was in like the 1980s, and they were running out of natural gas. And he said, well, guys, we got no future here. Let's figure out a way to get at shale. Shale, for those who don't know, it's basically just a layer well below the surface, as much as a mile or farther below the surface. And he said, guys, let's figure out how to get at shale. Everyone knew shale was packed with oil and gas. And everyone was skeptical, and they worked on it from 1982 to 1997. And there was a guy named Nick Steinsberger, who was a young geologist who was running the effort. And if you remember back in the late 1990s, no one really wanted to be in the oil and gas business. And he knew that if this didn't work out, he was going to have to find another industry, let alone, another job in the energy business. Everything was about, pets.com and all that kind of thing back then. So they were playing around with it, and they were trying to make it work, the hydraulic fracturing, which just means basically pummeling the rock with a combination of water and chemicals and sand. And back then there was more chemicals. It was kind of a foamy thing. And they weren't making much progress, and things were getting difficult for the company, and George Mitchell had cancer at the time, and his stock had tumbled. He had made all these charitable commitments. He couldn't meet them, and there was a lot of pressure. They were feeling a lot of pressure. And then lo and behold, one day, their contractor used way too much water in this whole mix I mentioned, that they fracture create little fractures, little fissures in the rock, and they hope to bring out natural gas. And they used too much water, and yet they found pretty good amount of natural gas coming from this well. And all the experts who were selling the expensive foams said, yeah, ignore that fluke. It's a fluke. It's not going to work. Don't use too much water. But Steinsberger didn't have much of a choice. He was running out of time, and it was cheaper to use a water-based substance. So he said, you know what? I'm going to ignore these guys and see if we can make it work. And they played with it, and they tweaked it. And it's a story of innovation and creativity and resilience and persistence. And that's what they did over the next couple of years. In the late 1990s, they figured out how to get a lot of natural gas from shale in this corner of Texas. And then they sold the company for a couple $1 billion, and eventually it really paved the way for this whole revolution.
Could you talk a little bit about the function of the landmen who sort of made the prospecting possible, or who sort of set the groundwork, no pun intended, for it?
Sure. So people often ask, why haven't we had a similar revolution in other countries? As I mentioned before, you have lots of countries packed with shale that has its own oil and gas. And part of the reason to me is that, there are a lot of reasons, and get into them, but one of the key reasons is that in the United States, individuals own their own land rights. So if you want, someone knocks on the door of this landman. Landmen are the people that go knocking on the doors and cutting deals. And you can't really do that in other countries. So I was in England promoting the book, and you can make a real strong argument why they should be fracking in the UK. They're running out of energy, North Sea, et cetera. It's expensive. But I wouldn't want it in my backyard either if I wasn't being compensated. And that's what these landmen do, and they are key to this whole revolution. They're the ones who work out the deals with individuals, and with landowners, homeowners, and farm owners, that kind of thing. And that, to me, was really lucky stroke for the United States, that, again, that individuals own their own land rights so they could lease their land and pave the way for this whole thing.
Right. And some of the big players, Chesapeake, with Aubrey McClendon.
So two of the key players in this whole revolution started off as landmen. That's an interesting point. So Aubrey McClendon and Tom Ward, should I just talk about them briefly?
Sure.
So Aubrey McClendon's a fascinating guy. And here's the theme that I want you to remember, the fact that it's unlikely individuals who created this whole revolution. So Aubrey McClendon, born in Oklahoma City, went to Duke, majored in history, not kind of geology or anything, didn't go to get some geology degree, whatever, was going to be an accountant, came back home and said, all right, you know what, I'm an outgoing guy, let me try the energy business for a while. And had that in his background, but they weren't exactly barons or anything like that. He was from the Carnegie family, but the wrong side of the family. Anyway, he starts as a landman, and basically he's going door to door and working out deals, and he's really charismatic and outgoing, and he's effective. And he kept bumping into this other guy, Tom Ward, who was a competitor, who also was a landman. And Ward's a very interesting, different kind of character. Also came from a small town in Oklahoma I spent some time in. Ward grew up troubled family. The Ward men were notorious drinkers, alcoholics. His grandfather used to come into church frequently, drunk and collapse, and they would kind of have pity on him and take care of him, and in the middle of services too. And his father also was an alcoholic. And Tom Ward at a young age found religion, literally, and he that helped steer him clear. And he became a landman, and a little more serious than Aubrey, and not as outgoing, but charismatic in his own way. And they kept bumping into each other, and they said, you know what, instead of fighting with each other, let's kind of work together and start a company. They started Chesapeake Energy. And I'll kind of zip through the story. Basically, they took a lot of risk and a lot of gambles, and they were one of the first people, not the only ones, and not the earliest, but one of the earliest to say, you know what, George Mitchell in Texas is onto something. And shale can produce a lot of natural gas, not just in Texas, though, because a lot of the experts said, yeah, George, you figured it out in Texas, but who's to say there's a lot of gas that can be found in shale anywhere else in this country? But McClendon and Ward said, you know what, we're going to prove them wrong. And they went and leased everywhere, all over the country. At one point, it was the size, 3 times the size of New Jersey was their holdings they had. And they kind of showed you can get a lot of natural gas from shale. The problem was there were a lot of problems, but they were quite aggressive, took on too much debt, owned too much of their own shares. They started a hedge funds while they were doing all this, and they were always long energy. I mean, you give them a lot of credit because they weren't kind of hedging themselves and they weren't selling their shares. They were leveraging up to buy even more shares. And so at one point in 2008, when oil and gas prices were soaring, they were worth about $2 or $3 billion each, and they were on top of the world. But they didn't notice what was happening in the industry, that they weren't the only ones finding it easier to find natural gas. Their competitors were too, and they didn't see what was coming, and that was a glut coming. So eventually, it really hurt them both. They both got kicked out of Tom Ward quit to start his own company, got kicked out of that one. McClendon got kicked out of Chesapeake. We all know he sadly passed away over the past year as he had started his new comeback, and it was once again long and leveraged long on natural gas. So coming from sort of a Wall Street background, I find these personalities kind of unique and almost a throwback, because now everyone hugs the index, and even hedge fund guys talk a big game, but they're just in it for the 20, the 2, not the 20, like they used to be. But these guys in the oil business, the wildcatters, they're still rolling the dice. I find them fascinating. Mm.
So getting back to Wall Street for a moment, Greg, and to this theme about why the experts missed it and the outsiders effectively, or the unconventionals, found the opportunity. You've written about both those scenarios, the huge discontinuity in the housing market and that collapse, and then this positive surge of U.S. energy. Can you point to a common theme as to why the incumbents, the experts, the guys who are established missed it, and why for so long?
Sure, and it's something I think about all the time, and afterwards I'd love to hear what people have to say as well. So it is a common theme. So the same thing with the financial crisis. You wouldn't think that fracking has anything to do with CDS contracts, but to me they do, because who should have anticipated the financial meltdown? It should have been the banks. The banks are the ones who created the toxic product. It's a little bit like, I liken it to a butcher who's got this poisonous meat, and instead of carving it up every day and selling it to clients, what does he do? He brings it home at night and gives it to his kids and starts eating it, and they all got sick from it all. And so the banks got sick on their own product. It's confounding if you think about it. And the very people that should have anticipated the financial meltdown didn't. I mean, Jim Chanos is a super smart guy, and he was here today, but he didn't get it right. Warren Buffett didn't anticipate the financial meltdown. I'm not saying they bet on housing, but they clearly didn't short housing. So you can go on and on. Mike Vranos is a mortgage guy. They didn't see it coming. I can go on and on. And who did anticipate it? It was a merger harb. It was John Paulson, who I write about in my book, who knew nothing about housing until around 2006. He knew as much as, I bought a house once, and he did too. That's kind of it. But he kind of said, these charts look a little troublesome. Let's look into this. And then he had a sidekick named Paolo Pellegrini. And Pellegrini had circled through multiple firms on Wall Street, a super smart guy, but he was a failure in a large way. And he was over 50, and he was hanging on by his fingernails onto his job. But he had overheard his boss saying he's a little worried about housing. So he's like, well, John, if you worry about housing, one of the past jobs I've been at, they did something with a CDS. And he's like, CDS? Let's go figure out what this thing is. And together, they put their heads together, and they made $20 billion over 2 years with this kind of bet that everyone else should have gotten, and they got it. So and there are other characters in the book too who are equally as unlikely to have anticipated and made the greatest trade ever. So again, to answer your question, so there are a lot of reasons I would argue, I'll give a couple, why it is that the experts keep getting it wrong and the outsiders get it right. Sometimes you need your back against the wall to make history and to buck conventional wisdom. So the incentive really is, especially in the financial industry, quite honestly, to go with the crowd. And there's a guy in my first book, Greg Lippmann, who I think is among the only guys that really on Wall Street who kind of ignored what everybody else was saying. And if you think about it, he was sort of not rational in his thinking, because what do? You go along with what everybody else, even if you think, let's say, there's a bubble forming in some investment. But if you go the other direction and you're wrong, you're out of a job. But what if you just go with everybody else? Oh, you get to say, oh, it was a 100-year flood, boss. There are all kinds of excuses, and everyone used them. The Fed used them. Everyone used them. Who could have anticipated this financial bubble? Or who would have? It's hard to predict bubbles, as Greenspan said. So the rational thing to do is to go along with the trend, and you sort of need to have your back against the wall. So that brings me to the frackers. And if you think about those kind of people, again, George Mitchell didn't have acreage offshore and in Asia and places, where he could drill. He only had Texas, so he had to make it work in Texas. And sometimes, you need, it's the mother invention, you need that pressure, no other choice. But there's also good luck involved as well. You need fortune in life. The older I get, the more I appreciate that there's a lot of luck involved. And you can be super smart and anticipate things, and it doesn't work out. There were people who were really early with the financial meltdown in 2005 and 2006, and they knew a lot more than John Paulson. I'm not saying John Paulson was not smart and that he was lucky. Well, he was lucky. He was lucky in that he was an outsider, so it helped that he got nervous about housing in 2007, which was when things were, or 2006, when things were starting to peak. But the early guys were a little bit too early, and they lost their bets, and they had to close them out. So there are a lot of other reasons I can get into, but those are among those.
So it obviously cost, going back to the frackers, it obviously cost the big companies to miss this initial wave as it came on. Would you say it has cost them in the long run, or have they been able to recover from that? Because clearly they're in it now. Right?
Yeah.
And actually, maybe as a corollary to that question, is there a broader benefit to the market and that economy as a whole as a result of them pouring into it now?
So it hurt them, but it didn't cripple them. So if you look at Exxon, for example, they're suffering, and they really recently had to kind of reduce the value of their reserves. That's because of oil prices coming down. But they suffered because they paid, I think it was like $44 billion for XTO at the top of the market. And XTO was one of these upstart independents, and they had to pay up for it because they had not expected this revolution in the United States. So it hurt to some extent, but it goes back to the last question, why the experts keep getting it wrong. Exxon didn't really have to be the first mover. And if you think about a lot of the other industries too, where you see innovation from outsiders or upstarts, let's say the pharmaceutical industry, I think it's 2/3 of the new drugs coming out today are not by big pharma, it's by biotech and kinds of companies. And you look at industry after industry, energy drinks were developed not by Coke and Pepsi, e-cigarettes weren't by big tobacco, I can go on. And it goes to that theme of necessity being the mother of invention, but it also goes to this theme that the incumbents sometimes can catch up quickly and just make acquisitions. So it works out okay for them. You have to pay up, and it hurts you, but it doesn't cripple you, and let other people make these mistakes, and you can come in if it works out. And
do you think it's benefited the industry overall now that they have sort of poured in? Because presumably they're pouring a lot of money into the space and their own R&D and sort of focused efforts on it now?
It's a good question. I think so, partly because they're innovating and they've got money for innovation, and they can handle this downturn better than independents. Some of the independents are fine. EOG, Pioneer, doing a great job in the Permian. Continental should be okay, even though they've got a lot of assets in North Dakota, which is still suffering. But the bigger guys can withstand a little bit better the pain, but also, and they can cut their costs a little bit better. But also, they're doing things safer. They're drilling in a better way, in a safer way, so they can learn a little bit more so than the independents who made some mistakes along the way. They got better, but you would think, all things being equal, Exxon can do a little safer than an upstart wildcatter.
Have a little more political incentive to do it right as
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
I guess, right, on the whole. So going back to other nations, I mean, it has been pointed out that there are shale deposits, vast shale deposits in a lot of other countries outside the United States. Your thoughts on, beyond, you already touched on land rights being a key issue in terms of being able to sell your rights as a private individual. Are there other reasons why in the US it's taken off so dramatically and other places it has really effectively not started yet?
Yeah, I kind of expected my book to be sort of a baton handing off from the United States, hands off to the rest of the world, because there are even deeper pockets of shale elsewhere. But there are a lot of advantages the United States has, some God-given. The shale deposits are deep. They're not as deep as they are in some nations like China. There also are pipelines built in the United States that you don't have elsewhere. You have capital markets. You know, I'm at the Wall Street Journal, so I'm a big believer in capital markets and the free flow of capital. And debt holders were responsible for this revolution as much as the wildcatters, because they pumped all this money into, and they lost a lot of money too along the way, supporting the revolution and the companies coming to the capital markets. But there's also a cultural thing, and as I travel to other countries, and Germans talk about it all the time, there's still a culture of risk-taking that the United States has, and maybe North America broadly. You see it, I was up in Calgary for a speech not that long ago. You see a lot of it there too. You've got, in the United States, if you fail, but you've had this grand vision, it's not as big an embarrassment as everywhere else in the world. You're done in some countries. You make a big mistake and you're in the financial, in a company, you're done. But here, if it was kind of a good idea and it didn't work out, you could raise money for the next idea much easier than anywhere else. It's almost, you get more respect almost. And I've found it almost, especially in the hedge fund world, not as much as it used to be, but a good 5-10 years ago, if you blew up, I would talk to these guys as they were blowing up, and I was always shocked by how calm they were. And granted, they had a lot of money in the bank already at that point, but this was some of the stuff that seemed embarrassing. I felt bad for them as I was talking to them on the phone, and invariably they were pretty calm and collected, and they moved on, and they were fine, because in this country, a big-time failure isn't as embarrassing as it is everywhere else. So you need that culture, and we still have it. And I don't think we in North America appreciate what we have as much. You have to travel to really kind of appreciate that, and that's part of the reason why we do so well. I mean, you know, other countries, their kids do better in school than we do, and they beat us in tests and all that kind of stuff. But we still have a culture of entrepreneurs are saluted, and we've got things like what's the CNBC show? It's on all the time. Anyway, we salute these guys who come up with business ideas. That's the greatest thing you could do today in our culture.
Yeah. Well, and I would say, as an observation from our part, we love to live in Canada. We love to do business in the States. And there is, I would say, a cultural difference in terms of how Canadians decide to invest and how Americans decide to invest. It's why we've consistently done our first investing in the States, and our first business venture is always in the States. Canadians will circumspectly walk around the problem many times before they'll plunge in. Americans are like, that looks like a cool idea. I'll give that a try, you know? And,
for good or for bad, maybe we don't spend enough time thinking about it. You know, it produces certain, political problems. But I'm not going to.
It has produced some of these results.
Yes, but business-wise, it can help. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's fast forward to where we are today. Oil, as I last looked earlier today, was sitting at $45 for WTI, down from highs of 50 a little while ago, and obviously up from the real lows a little while ago. As you've sort of kept track of this trajectory of fracking, how do you think that's playing out in the field? Or what do you see playing out in the field?
So the frackers are suffering, and there's a lot of pain. There have been job losses and huge monetary losses as well. But there's this resilience in the industry when you talk to people, and it's almost like they kind of expected at some point this to happen, or some version of this. Maybe not as quickly and as abruptly, but I always find it pretty impressive. And if there's a veteran in the industry, they're like, yeah, Greg, we've gone through this before. We can handle it. And the interesting thing is, behind the scenes, there's been a lot of innovation just the last few years, doing things like using more sand in the fracking, and they've cut their costs. They keep innovating. I mean, it's a story about oil and gas, but it's really a story of technology. and innovation and creativity. And people like Peter Thiel say we don't innovate anymore, but we do. You got to get out there and see this stuff. So they've brought their costs down, and they don't need prices to get higher than 55, 60 to start making money. So I'm a big believer that there's sort of a kind of a cap on where prices are going. And yeah, there's India and China and the modernization and middle class is growing, and that'll create demand. But there are also other things like autonomous cars that are coming, and there are other reasons to think demand will be offset. And I'm a believer in long term in a shift to things like solar and wind. It's all about battery, it's all about storage, and they're smart innovators, creative guys, entrepreneurs working on the battery and the storage. And if you can figure that out, then that sends it all back down.
Right. So how about the tip of the century? Are we going back to $100 for a barrel of oil?
Yeah, listen, if I'd be a trader, I'm just a writer, so I write about the smart guys. But it's hard for me to see anytime soon.
I did actually see something recently that suggested that fracking in Texas, as you said, is very much a technology and a sort of process improvement kind of play, could easily get to $25 a barrel as a break-even cost within the next 2 to 3 years. As a
break-even, yeah. It depends where. You can't get that in North Dakota. Some parts of Texas, it's cheaper. You're near pipelines and such.
Right. So I'd like to just, I think this is a question that has always crossed my mind. I think in sort of cursory reading about fracking, you generally hear about the bad news stories, methane coming out of people's water taps and groundwater polluted and so on. Talk about what you see as the environmental impact of fracking, the good and the bad.
Yeah, so I put some work into it. Not as much as my critics would say, especially the New York Times. But this part of the book, and I spent time in Dimick, and I've talked to all the experts, and I came away with the view that fracking can be done safely. It's just not always done safely. There are mistakes made along the way. And the sad part is, on every issue of importance in the United States, there's this divisiveness, and we can't forge a compromise. And I'm very much a moderate. So my big belief is instead of condemning the frackers, we should be working with them and putting pressure on them. And instead, for various reasons, some of them cynical, some of them not, people just hate. One side is sort of fracking poisons and drilling poisons, and they hate fossil fuels. The other is kind of drill baby drill kind of thing, which is quite sad to me. So yeah, I've looked at the impact on water. It's unlikely. Talk to scientists. Could the chemicals somehow miraculously go up through a mile of rock? It's possible. It's unlikely. Are there spills? For sure. There are fewer than there used to be. They're really, and I've gone to Dimick, and I've talked to older people in Dimick, and they're like, and I'm sure people have seen Gasland. Raise your hand if you've seen Gasland, that movie Gasland, where they turn on the faucet. Maybe people in the country haven't. If you turn on the faucet, you light the match, and there's a big ball of fire, and it's scary. So I've talked to people in Dimick, and they're like, Greg, before fracking, we used to get to school early, turn on the faucet, light a match, and run for it. And there was a big fire because naturally in that part of the United States,
methane comes up.
Methane comes in the water. It's not to say that there aren't mistakes made all the time, but again, it can be done safely. I want to put more pressure on them instead of condemning them.
Great. Thanks, Greg. So to totally change gears for 30 more seconds, can you tell us a little bit about your latest book?
Oh, sure. So, and I didn't realize it's nice. I think it's available for people. I wrote a book for young people. I actually wrote it with my 2 sons. It's called Rising Above. And believe it or not, there's some similarities. So I'm a big believer in writing about characters, unlikely heroes. Or, the left doesn't like when I call a business person hero, but people that have changed the course of history and such, and the sports guys are among them. So basically, these are all sports stars who overcame various things in their youth. And we wrote it for young people to give them inspiration, and entertainment as well, and motivation. And there's everything from racism and poverty and physical differences and emotional abuse and physical abuse. And it's remarkable to us what these people have overcome. So we thought we'd share it with people. It's really aimed at young people, but hopefully it gives people that motivation and grit and resilience that we're all trying to hope our kids have. So that was the idea. And we're going to do one focused on female stars that'll be out next year.
Great. Greg, thank you so much.
Sure thing.
It's been fascinating.